Hello, everyone. I'm Lydia Gregovic. I'm the author of The Monstrous Kind. I'm so excited to be moderating this beautiful, lovely panel. So I will go ahead and get started, if that's all right with everyone. All right, so first things first, I want to introduce our lovely panelists. I have my list of bios here. It might not match those seating order, so I apologize. I'm going to start with Sarah Hawley. Sarah is the author of A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon, A Demon's Guide to Wooing a Witch, and A Werewolf's Guide to Seducing a Vampire. Sarah lives in the Pacific Northwest, where her hobbies include rambling through the woods and appreciating fictional villains. Good hobbies. She has a master's degree in archaeology and has excavated at an Inca site in Chile, a Bronze Age palace in Turkey, and a medieval abbey in England. When not dreaming up whimsical love stories, she can be found reading, dancing, or cuddling her 2 cats. Next, we have Sabaa Tahir. Sabaa is a former newspaper editor who grew up in California's Mojave Desert at her family's 18-room motel. There, she spent her time devouring fantasy novels, listening to thunderous indie rock, and playing guitar and piano badly. Her #1 New York Times bestselling and Ember in the Ashes series has been translated into more than 35 languages, and the first book in the series was named one of Time's 100 best young adult books of all time, as it should. Tahir's most recent novel, All My Rage, won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Boston Globe Horn Book Award for Fiction and Poetry. Next up, we have Danielle L. Jensen. Danielle is the New York Times bestselling author of A Fate Inked in Blood, as well as the USA Today bestselling author of The Bridge Kingdom, Dark Shores, and Malediction series. Her novels are published internationally in 15 languages. She lives in Calgary, Alberta, with her family and guinea pigs. And next we have Amelie Wen Zhao. Amelie was born in Paris and grew up in Beijing, where she spent her days reenacting tales of legendary heroes, ancient kingdoms, and lost magic at her grandmother's courtyard house. She attended college in the United States and now resides in New York City, working as a finance professional by day and fantasy author by night. In her spare time, she loves to travel and spend time with her family in China, where she's determined to walk the rivers and lakes of old, just like the practitioners in her novels do. Amelie is the author of the Blood Air trilogy, Song of Silver, Flame Like Night, and its sequel, Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White, and the upcoming The Scorpion and Night Blossom. And to close us out, we have Kayla Cottingham. Kayla is a former teen librarian and New York Times bestselling author of sapphic horror and fantasy novels, including Practical Rules for Cursed Witches. Originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, Kayla lives in Boston, where they love to go hiking in the woods, play RPGs, and snuggle on the couch with their ridiculously large black cat, Squid. So to start us off, we are here to talk about romantasy versus romantic fantasy, which I'm very excited to hear our panelists discuss. To get us kind of in the mood and break the ice a little bit, I wanted to start with a bit of a fun question. I am a Gen Z cusper, so I'm on TikTok all the time, and I'm obsessed with the Hear Me Out trend. I don't know if you guys are familiar. But basically, this is, crush that might be controversial. Maybe they're not human. They're morally repulsive, as some would say. But so I've asked our panelists to tell me their favorite fictional Hear Me Outs. So we're going to start with Kayla and just go down the line.
Just really set the mood with how weird we are. So not deep cut, Shrek. I think that he's funny. I think he is honestly. He's got a little something going for him. Deeper cut, if anyone is a fan of Baldur's Gate, I was really into Carnis, who is the Drider half spider.
Yeah!
Who has a bunch of spare eyes going down one side of his face, and it was he's evil. We just kill him for a side quest. I'm I think he's kind of. But yeah.
That is amazing.
Okay, so mine, I'm going with an actual human, I'm sorry. But they are of the morally repugnant variety. Mine is Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. He has goals. He's a void. Universe, most of these people do not have jobs. He has a great fashion sense and he gives a good speech. And I'm just like, unironically, I'm like, I might.
Mine is not really controversial. It's the Darkling. I'm sorry. I met the Darkling and was like, I love you. And you are now the love of my life. And it did not help when Ben Barnes played. That did not make things better. But I also, my second is maybe a little more less known, and that is Terraston from Victoria Aveyard's Realmbreaker series. He is awful. Horrible, horrible, monstrous human, and yet.
Mine is so not controversial. I'm sorry, just to disappoint. It's also very niche. I don't know if anyone has seen or watched like you know when you're a child you see something and it just imprints on you. Like I was 6 or 7 when I watched this Chinese adaptation of a folk tale. It's called Hawley or something like Lotus Lantern, I guess. The main character in there was so cute as a kid. He goes after the gods to save his mom and get a magic pill to revive her, which made its way into a bunch of my stories. But then he had a glow up moment. It was 10 years later. You know when Simba grew up? that was me when he had to glow up and he became 16, 17, and then 6-year-old me was like, hey.
I am so mainstream. I am totally trash for Damon from House of the Dragon right now. I don't know how they're making me ship that particular relationship because obviously she's his niece, but there's just something about him. He's just that morally gray, and he's a little bit different looking, and I don't know. Every time he comes on the screen, I'm pretty sure my husband is just
Well, this delighted me. I feel like I've made you all play my personal favorite game, so thank you. And my hear me out is Gil the fish from Finding Nemo. Okay, so to dive right in, this question is for the group, saying we can just go right down the line. And I want to start us off. We're all gathered here today to discuss romantasy. But I would like to ask each of you, what to you differentiates fantasy with a strong romance from romantasy? Where does the distinction lie? Or is there one at all?
So I'm first, so clearly I'm the authority on this. I'm not. So I would argue that the difference between fantasy with a strong romance plotline and romantasy is that I view romantasy as a romance novel that takes place in a fantasy world versus a fantasy novel that has a romance. So when I went about writing this book, Practical Rules for Cursed Witches, it was very much a romance. The fantasy stuff that happened in between just happened to be more sort of circumstances to make them kiss.
And this is interesting because I actually disagree with you. This is the debate because to me, if it's about what the second word is. So if it's a romantic fantasy and you smash that together, fantasy is the main category for me, whereas you get a fantasy romance, that means the romance comes first. So my Glimmer Falls series, I would call fantasy romance. I would not call them romantasy, but Servant of Earth I would call romantasy because it's a fantasy first and foremost. There is a love story. The love story is not self-contained in one book. And I think that's something that you don't have to have a standalone love story. It can spread over multiple books if it's a romantasy book, where I don't think you can do that necessarily in a romance. I do also think it is kind of a marketing term, so I don't know if there's much of a differentiation between romantic fantasy and romantasy for me. I would say if you are going to use the romantasy label, I think you should have a happy ending. I do think that's a line. Whereas if it's a romantic fantasy, maybe you don't have to.
This is so interesting.
I'm splitting such hairs here, but
I agree with both of you. When I think of romance, this is my 15-year-old boy self coming out. Guys, I think of body parts.
think of descriptions of body parts that are very detailed and explicit. That is what I think of when I think of romantasy. And I think it is a marketing thing. I think it's just that a lot of the books recently that have been marketed as romantasy are like velvet sheep stuff, you know? So,
Velvet sheep.
One of my
Shaft.
least
I know what you're talking about.
favorite, my least favorite terms.
I love that you asked.
I was actually going to get to that. My contribution to this, and I agree with what you just said. I think romantasy to me does have some body parts, has some spice. And when I'm looking for romantasy, and when I'm looking to write a romantasy, that's what I'm aiming for. It's more, the romance plotline has to be at least 50% of the book for me. Whereas I think romantic fantasy is a fantasy that, has romantic elements. I think for me, the intention is also really interesting for the author. Like when I set out to write the Song of the Last Kingdom duology, this is not romantasy. It's not romantic fantasy, it's epic fantasy. My next book, which is about like a hot demon falling in love with a mortal, is a romantasy. I set out to write it as a romantasy. So I think I was discussing with another author who wrote a Chinese historical love story, and she was like, people are labeling it as romantasy, but it's not. It's a love story, but it's not a romance story.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing fantasy romance, romantic fantasy, romantasy for a long time now, and I think that romantasy came about in some ways because nobody could remember the difference between the two. So it's become a bit of a catch-all phrase. However, if it is inaccurately used on a book and you go into it thinking it is a romantasy and it's not, there's going to be inevitable disappointment. So I do think it's being over-deployed. But for me, romantasy, the book requires the romance in order to exist as a book. If you took out the romance, there's not enough extraneous plot going on to hold it together, or if you subbed in a friendship or a different type of relationship, the book would not work. So to me, that is a romantasy novel. And then, of course, there's going to be intimate scenes associated with the various romantic relationships in it, lots of shafts and claws going on. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. This was all amazing. I am familiar with the velvet sheath. So all right, my next question is kind of an expansion on this, and it is for Kayla and Amelie. Now that we've heard from everyone, I want to delve a little deeper into the origins of romantasy. And I feel like Danielle kind of touched on this, but do you consider romantasy to be a new evolution of an iconic genre or an acknowledgement of a subgenre which has always existed?
The authority. Definitely not new. I think it's definitely an acknowledgement of something that has existed for so long, but it's exploded into more mainstream and gotten so much popularity that the label itself is now, more of a thing. Whereas so many acclaimed authors have been writing romantasy or fantasy romance for such a long time. So I definitely think it's the label.
I agree with that. I also think that it was very much popularized by book talk. So there is a certain amount of it that when you look at romantasy as a genre, it is kind of talking about this specific TikTok version of it a lot of the time. I will also say my book is about cis queer women, so there are no shafts. But I really support you all.
All right, my next question.
I'm an ally.
All right, this one is for Sarah, Sabaa, and Danielle. When we talk about romantasy and romance, my mind often turns to tropes as well. So my question is twofold. First, do you ever write with a specific trope or relationship dynamic in mind when you're crafting a story? And if so, how do you balance abiding by the rules of a trope? Like if it's only one bed, there has to be like one bed or one whatever they're sleeping in. While also surprising the reader.
I started with the Bridge Kingdom before trope marketing and TikTok were even exist. TikTok didn't even exist. So I was writing a lot of these tropes, and I was aware that they were tropes, but the idea that you would try and shoehorn them in a way so that you could have a TikTok with a whole bunch of trope lists on it just was not even something I was thinking about. For me, I'm always inserting them knowing what they are, but they're working with the plot. I don't force the plot in order to have a one-horse scene or one bed or, various things. But I mean, tropes are just so ingrained in what we write that they just pop up naturally without you having to go into the novel with a list of things that you want to insert. I always find it's a lot more organic for me anyway than a forced situation.
I love a good trope, of course. My current book has a fake engagement, which is one of my favorite tropes. But the way I usually look at tropes is sort of what is a scene that is sitting in my head. Sometimes they're tropey and sometimes they're not. And if they are tropey, I really try to think about how will I make this work for these characters and their journeys in this specific book. Because generally, again, very similar to what you were saying, Danielle, if I have a trope in my mind and it doesn't work with the characters because if there's a one bed situation, and I have, kind of a CAD, in the room, he's gonna be yeah, one bed or, whatever. But I like to kind of subvert just a little bit, and have it be less of a typical thing and more something that fits very well with the character's journey. But I do love tropes. I think they're really fun. I'm actually really happy that Goodreads and TikTok has labeled tropes because it allows me to if I just want to scratch that itch, it allows me to find a book that will do that for me. So actually, I really love the TikToks with the tropes list because I'm yes, that one.
I think the tropes are inherently tied to character. They're often the catalyst for change. So to me, it depends what the pairing is and what the dynamic is to which trope is going to yield the most interesting results. So if you have enemies, which is always my favorite, enemies to lovers, you want something that's going to force them into such close proximity that they have to give in to the tension between them. So that's where you get an only one bed or something like that. So to me, it all comes from the specific dynamic and the push and pull between two characters in terms of what's going to get you the most explosive moments, so to speak. But I think it's fun to play with tropes and subvert them slightly. So. I have a dream someday of doing an anthology called Too Many Beds, where okay, hear me out. So a bunch of people get snowed in an IKEA overnight. There's so many beds. You have to build them all. And it's just all these authors, and everyone writes about one specific bed in this IKEA. So I think there's elements it's fun. It's there to be played with. It's there to, and I think it's a lot. There's this sort of secret language we all have as readers of romance, where we're I know what this is. Oh, fake dating. I kind of know what's gonna happen. And so it's really fun to play with those expectations and when you fulfill them and how you fulfill them. But it's not I set out to be I am going to write one bed. I set out to write characters who hate each other, and then I have to stuff them in a closet or something, and that's interesting.
No, I think you're right. I feel it is a secret language almost between fans, so it's really cool. And also, I love this anthology, and I fear many breakups would also occur in the IKEA. Sarah, I'm sorry to come right back to you, but I have another question for you. So you have written, as you said, both cozy, grounded fantasy, your Glimmer Falls series, and high fantasy with your upcoming book, Servant of Earth. I'm curious to know, did you discover any differences between writing the romances in your Glimmer Falls series and writing the romances in Servant of Earth? What remained consistent across books, and what, if anything, changed?
Yeah, I mean, to me, again, it's all about character, and love story is going to spring from the characters and how they express themselves and their wants, and the ones they acknowledge out loud and the ones they don't. And so for me, any satisfying romance, they have to fulfill something the other person is missing so that the whole is stronger together. I will say it's fun doing a series across multiple books because you don't, you have a standalone romance we're going to start with them not being together, we're going to end with them together. You have something that's a trilogy, you have a little more freedom to play with, perhaps multiple love interests, perhaps exploring different dynamics, not necessarily having the healthiest dynamic. That can be fun. So to me, I don't know, it's just a slightly different muscle where you're you're trying to fulfill the expectations of the genre. But to me, it's always about the character, and so that's the beating heart, the core of it. Is just figuring out what do two people need, what do they have to offer each other, and ultimately, like, are they healthier together? And if not, what? I think there's more room for them to not be healthy together.
I feel like everyone here saw me perk up when she said multiple love interests. Okay, Kayla, I would love to come back to you. So you've also written kind of across genres. You've written dark academia, zombie-adjacent horror, and now cozy fantasy. What do you think it is about the fantasy genre specifically that makes it so ideal to pair with romance? Do you think we will soon see rom sci-fi or rom horror, or is romantasy a unique blend?
So I kind of view romance as seasoning, where I think that there is a beautiful dish in any genre, but I can make it better if there's enough kissing. So with my first two books, they were both horror, and both of them do feature strong romantic elements. I would argue that Practical Rules for Cursed Witches, which is cozy fantasy, is the most romantic of those, purely because in my first two books, they were busy dealing with like ancient gods and cannibalizing boy bands. And whereas in Practical Rules, it's a lot more focused on the actual sort of development of the relationship between the two characters, Briar and Delilah, who are both witches who are trying to break family curses that have made it somewhat hard for them to find love. One, because she is cursed to never find love, and the other because she is cursed to turn into a monster sometimes. That happens to the best of us. But yeah, I very much think that really any genre, you can find a way to add romance if you fully believe in yourself, and just it's about creating those tensions between characters. It's such a good way to build character. It's such a good way to highlight the dynamics between characters, and I won't stop.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I very much am waiting for like the rom sci-fi that's gonna capture me. So
Rom-com sci-fi.
if anyone has a rec. Okay, Amelie. I have a controversial question for you, and I feel like Sarah kind of touched on this, so I'm excited to see what you say. But do you think a happy ending is a vital piece of a romantasy? Can there be a romantasy where the leads do not end up together?
I have thought about this question like way before this panel, and I'm excited that you asked me. I'll give two answers. First of all, Romance Writers of America defines a romance as happily ever after or happy for now. And I think that if you are marketing your books as romantasy in this market, then yes, it needs a happily ever after. It's about reader expectations, right? I think with readers, they're going into a romance and fantasy romance or romantasy with the expectation that it's going to work out. It's not a tragedy. I'll tell you something fun about what we do in Chinese culture or Chinese pop culture. Before we start any kind of a fantasy romance book or fantasy romance show, all my friends, all on the internet, we ask, does this show have HE or BE? Happy ending or bad ending? It's something we do. I was like my mom used to do this. She would spoil the endings of shows, and then I was like, oh, it's this practice, like HE or BE. And I don't know that in that market, especially for Chinese diaspora or any diaspora authors, right? I don't know that we have a distinction between all these different subgenres we're debating today. So I don't really have an answer in the second context. I don't know where it falls, but I think if you're marketing specific to the US or anywhere where romance is defined as HEA, I think that is important. Yeah.
That's such a good answer. Also, I relate to your mom because I spoil everything for myself.
I would be like, oh my gosh, I like the second prince. She's like,
Okay, continuing. My next question is for Sabaa. So your first series, the Ember and the Ashes series, released before the romantasy movement kind of got its footing. Now your newest fantasy duology is coming out in the prime of this movement. How do you think the rise of romantasy has impacted the way we talk about this genre, and do you think there are any downsides?
That's a big question. I think the downsides are that I actually don't love doing a full happily ever after in my books. If you've read them, you know this. I do think that sometimes having sort of a partially happily ever after is good, and so I actually chief against the reader expectation that there should always be a happily ever after. And I think that's in a large part because I base a lot of what my books are about stuff that's happening in the real world. And the real world isn't happily ever after, but I also understand that people come to books for an escape. I know I did. So I do wish that the expectations weren't maybe as specific. I would like to have a little freedom to sort of do what I want, but I kind of do it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Also, you had mentioned a sci-fi romantasy. This is how you lose the time.
Yes.
It's a beautiful
Yes.
romantasy. It is my favorite book. So if you need one, that's a good one.
No, thank you.
But back to your question. So those are like sort of the drawbacks. Tell me the first part of your question again.
My first part was, how do you think the rise of romances impacted the way we talk about the genre?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that I think a lot of people are far more comfortable talking about the fantasy books they love. I think it's much more like normalized. I was never a person who was like embarrassed of my like bodice rippers. I always very proudly would read them and be like, yes, this is amazing, and it's very difficult to write. And I don't think there's enough respect for romance writers and particularly fantasy romance writers, probably because they are often women. And sorry, men, but you guys kind of suck. And so I think that women and girls' love are often mocked. And so I love the fact that the love of romantasy is so great that it cannot be mocked anymore. There are too many of us who love it. And I love that about it. So that to me sort of is the best part about it and kind of overshadows anything negative. There's so many of us and there's so many romantasy books, and it is deeply satisfying to be able to find kind of an endless sea of them. So yay. Yes.
No, I agree. It feels like almost an expansion of like the fandom love you feel, you know, just like for a whole genre. It's amazing. Okay, so my last question actually is for Danielle. Danielle, I would love to close things out with a final craft-based question for you. The universes you create in your novels are epic in every sense of the word, as well as so unique. Do the worlds your characters inhabit impact the romances they find in any way, or do the love stories and the world building operate independently?
That's a good question. When I create my worlds, I want my plot it can only exist in that world. So the world becomes almost like a character in the sense that it's interacting in the plot. It's not just window dressing. So Bridge Kingdom being a very easy example that the bridge is so critical to the plot of the story. The story doesn't exist with that plot element and the way the world has been set up. But I created the world in order to serve the plot and to serve the characters within it. So the world is very much functioning interactively with the what I've set up. So for me, it's just, it has to be in that world. There is no other world it can be in and still work. And I think that that's where your settings become more memorable because they're so important on every element of the story. Whereas if you just have generic Western medieval world, you know, it doesn't, it's not memorable because it hasn't served or been an adversary to the characters in any way, and so you don't remember it because it's not important. And so for me, I want my settings to be so important that when a reader comes out of it, even 5 years later, they will remember elements of the setting.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of growing up and reading my favorite fantasies, and even as an adult, remembering these specific pieces of the world and being like, oh my god, well, you know, almost like trivia questions. And you're like, I remember that. Never. Thank you guys all so much. This has just been incredible. Let me. Should we do some questions? Okay, great. So if you guys are comfortable with it, we can do a few audience questions, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, awesome. All right, yeah, just raise your hand and someone will come around. Yes.
can just
interject?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I can be loud.
Yeah.
Is there a book that's labeled as romantasy, like on TikTok, where you're like, that's not romantasy, that's, some other genre? Because I run into that a lot at my library where somebody's like, oh, there's this great romantasy I saw on TikTok, and I'm looking at them, checking it out, and like, that's not what you think it is.
I try to stay away from TikTok. I have
So
seen
valid.
there's a book that I absolutely loved. I think it's a beautiful book, and I've seen it on some romantasy lists, and I do not think it's romantasy, and that's A Song to Drown Rivers. I was like, that is fantasy. But it's an absolutely gorgeous book, and I really think you should all pick it up.
I've also read that book and I adore it, and I second that recommendation.
Sometimes Ember gets labeled as romantasy, and I'm like, no.
No.
I'll be deeply disappointed. Like, I kill a lot of people. And you're not going to be happy. So I always try to correct when I see that. I'm like, no. It's just an epic fantasy. Like, please, if you see it, be like, no, she said it's an epic fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always hard for us sitting up here to be critical of how, especially if the branding has come from the author, we're not going to call anyone out. I think that lots of times on TikTok, people, they love a book and they just don't know how to correctly label it, and they're just trying to express their love of it. And so, it can steer you the wrong way, but I think it's almost always in good spirit.
Alright, we have another one back here.
That's a great question. How do you incorporate fantasy into, kind of breaking the normative? I think I'm
Yeah.
in a
non-normative way. Very important.
I'll start off just by saying that because I write YA, which is aimed at teenagers, a lot of the sexuality that is portrayed in my books tends to be a lot lighter than what you would get in an adult romantasy, simply because I don't have a lot of desire to write about specifically romance that is meant to be titillating for the reader, because that's not what I want to do with teenage characters. So I think with YA you have a slightly different sort of situation than you do with adult, where you don't want to be sort of turning teenagers into sex objects, essentially. So I will sort of refrain from answering the question because of that. But now you guys had a chance to think about it.
I try to do a lot, more of a slow burn, and I have had a lot of readers who are asexual say that they really appreciate that the romance in the books is, particularly in the first series, is not as central, because it allows them to just enjoy some of the more closer relationship moments, but not necessarily the sexual moments. Because there aren't a lot, because very similarly, I write for young adults, and my characters are older, they're in their early 20s and late teens, but the books still are marketed for young adults, so I do try to kind of step back a little and not really build the relationship as well as sort of the tension.
I think desire manifests in different ways. Like for me, the best example I have is me watching. Do you guys know Singles Inferno? It's like an Asian dating show where the maximum that they'll get to is hold your hand. And like, oh my god! And then my friend showed me The Bachelor. First meeting the Bachelorettes, they kiss. I was like, what is happening? So I think desire in the books I write, which is for Chinese fantasy, it manifests in slightly different ways. It's like lingering kissing, lingering love, and more slow burn. Like if you see, someone's wrist, like, oh my gosh, a lot. So I think it manifests in different ways for me.
And I write full smut, guys. I'm trash. But I think the way that fantasy manifests in romance is the same way it can manifest in plot, which is that it allows stakes and everything to be slightly exaggerated and metaphor to be exaggerated. And so you can really you can do some I'm like, oh my god. I have a vampire and a werewolf in my third Glimmer Falls book, and it's a very cozy book, but like there is intimate vampire biting, which you could not have in a mainstream romance, but probably. I don't know. Probably that would be questionable and someone would go to jail. But I don't know. I just think it's fun and it allows you to think about how magical powers would be incorporated, and it just everything is slightly heightened and slightly exaggerated in fantasy, and I like that.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My question is specifically for Sabaa. Sabaa, you're a South Asian American woman, and in South Asian culture, sex isn't openly talked about. And to be a romantasy author or a romance fantasy author can be a taboo. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about that experience and how your family has shown up for you or not shown up for you, I don't know. And what you would tell other South Asian authors that are looking to be in this space.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I feel like you'll have something to say about this as well, but
Yes.
because our cultures have a lot in common. But you know, I was very fortunate. I had a lot of support from my family. My mom loves those scenes. She pretends that she doesn't, and she'll be like, I edited it, she wrote it. They're in the cabin together. You know, and then she'll like reread them. So, you know, what I try to do is I want my young readers to feel comfortable. So whether they're South Asian or not, I want them to feel comfortable wherever they are in their personal sexual journey. I want them to feel like reading this is not pushing them in a direction they don't want. It's not making them feel anything uncomfortable. So that is what I think of first. But it also really benefits me that a lot of my South Asian younger readers, you know, they feel fine because the relationships have been built up. It doesn't feel sudden to them. It doesn't feel unexpected. It feels like this is the right thing to happen at this time in the book. I have had parents and, you know, even like non-parents, just like very like judgy people be like, you know, why do you have sex in this book? And I'm like, because it's a part of life for many people, not everyone, but for many people. And it sometimes will come back to me, but for the most part, folks have been very supportive. I will say that my 15-year-old read my books. When I was 13. And, you know, I knew the moment that he read some of the sex scenes because he kind of came downstairs and he was like, yeah, I skipped a few pages. That's fair. You do what works for you. And so I tell parents, I'm like, read the book. If you're like not worried about the hideous violence in my book, you're really worried about the sex, then read the book. And I guarantee you're probably not going to have that big of a problem with it. And if you do, buy some Post-it notes, man. Just so that is generally what I tell people.
I will say I'm really glad my family doesn't read English. My parents and then my dad tried to read a few pages of this and he just like Google Translate and just gave up. But I think it depends on, you know, where you are from, what your background is with the diaspora. There are so many different kinds of us, right? So there's a difference between, you know, my family who's literally in China versus the first-gen immigrants in America or anywhere else versus their children who've grown up immersed in a different culture, right? So I have friends who are, you know, I think it's called second-gen immigrants, yeah, who've grown up in American culture. They're like, yeah, like, give me the spice. I'm like, I got you, girl. I like cringe to think of my cousins and like my family in China like reading a lot of spice. And I think it's just, it comes with, you know, how comfortable you are with your family, how, you know, your family dynamics are growing up. So I think it's different for different parts of the diaspora.
I have a follow-up, if that's okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry. just because of the way you both were talking, I can't think off the top of my mind of a lot of romantasy authors or romance fantasy authors that are Asian, right? So in my mind, it's like very few names are out there. For example, Melanie Singh is a very prominent South Asian name. And I remember growing up in India, like reading Mills and Boons or any of those publications that were hardcore fantasies with a lot of explicit content was just not a thing. So for any of us that are in the audience that are Asian, can you guys name some authors that you think are really good in that genre that you guys enjoy reading?
Yeah, I love Renee Attia's books. She's half Korean and writes beautiful YA fantasy. YA romantasy. And I like Tasha Suri too. She's a South Asian author who I think does a really lovely job with fantasy. So yeah, those are a couple of mine. Definitely Renee with the Shatter Me series. I'm sorry, I'm so very tired. Tara Mafi with the Shatter Me series, just books of my soul. And then Nisha J. Tully, Trial of the Sun Queen, amazing book. So one, Nisha is adult romantasy, I think, and then Tara is YA romantasy or fantasy.
Thank you both.
All right, I think we have time for a couple more questions, so.
That's so funny.
What is your guys' perspective about the idea of rather than it being like a love triangle or a good romance, of the outcome actually being a polyamory? And I'm talking about actual polyamory where everybody actually loves each other, not weird thoughts.
Thank you for that question.
I want that. I want to read that, and if you have recommendations, please give them to me because I love a wide choose. I'm like the love triangle is just it should go every direction. So I don't know. I just get fully in favor. Does anyone have any recommendations?
Bridget Kavanagh's new book that's coming out is going to be Hawley.
Who?
Bridget Kavanaugh.
Noted.
There we go. Defy the Night would be one of her books, but she has a new one that's coming out, and I think she's just an editorial, but I believe that one is Hawley. And then of course the reverse harem romantasy market, which is like very popular in the indie space, is very much a wide choose. So you have usually it would be one woman and many men, and they all end up together, and that is a very searchable, but that is going to be usually a high heat, very explicit, sex forward type of novel, and as far as stuff that is a little bit more fantasy world development, I think we need more is really what I'm coming down to here. Iron Widow. Yes.
And Brittany and Williams Patrick Saga, I think it's going to be fun as well.
Thank you guys all for this. I think we're gonna do one more. And I don't know who to pick first, so I'm gonna go to questions.
Right here.
So y'all talked about how like you see the like rise of romantasy as a term as like a marketing thing first and foremost. So I was just wondering how y'all feel that marketing has like either constricted or allowed like the expansion of like fantasy romance and romantasy in of itself, because like you mentioned, it is something that has existed for a long time.
I think things are always easier to market when you have a label on them. It's just neater, it's in a box, people understand what they're getting. It's more satisfying to talk about because like you know the rules and you know like the tropes as we sort of discussed. So I feel like it does allow for just an easier conversation. Folks know exactly what it is, or when you explain it to them, they're like, oh, I get that, right? So it is almost a matter of communication around the concept being easier than it was. Like I feel like when I would explain my books earlier, I'd be like, you know, it is a fantasy and there's like a little bit of romance in it, and I still say that about my early work. But with this one, I can say, it leans more romance as well as fantasy. It's both equally, right? And it just makes it a little bit easier to communicate.
It's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that it's a lot easier for people to find books that they're interested in if they're able to search by trope or by, genre, saying romantasy, saying like what if you want like sapphic relationships, Achillean, so on and so forth. But at the same time, it does tend to boil books down to sort of like the very bare essentials, so it can be hard sometimes to really understand exactly what a book is if you're just sort of going by tropes. So it is that sort of like, toss-up of how useful is it to be able to say like, oh, I really like this one trope, but maybe they're not using it in exactly the way that I anticipated. So again, double-edged sword in my opinion.
Because it's such a spectrum of content that you can have within the romantasy, it is an easy label in a way to be underneath. It's not restrictive. There's so much that you can write. There is, if you write Western romance, like that is a very specific type of book, but romantasy is very inclusive in so many ways, and so it is nice that so many different types of books that are represented, so many different types of people can fall into this very big phenomenon and a marketing label, and I do think it's helped elevate a lot of authors that might have struggled in the years before it was more defined. I do think it has really helped a lot of people break out, having that term to be able to be part of this movement.
I agree. I think it's the fun of the fan language too, like we were talking about. It's so nice to kind of have this wide vocabulary that you can kind of talk about with people and just have this connection and be able to invent kind of this way of communicating with other people who are like-minded. I think it's so fun. We have about 5 minutes left. So if you guys are open to it, I wanted to do something last minute. Since we started with kind of a lightning round, I wanted to close with kind of a lightning round, and I would love to hear your favorite trope, and then if there is a trope that you either would really struggle to write, maybe like it's never connected with you. I don't want to say least favorite trope because I don't want to, leave any least favorites here. But yeah, maybe one that's not as a hero.
My favorite trope is like wound care.
Yeah.
Somebody gets hurt on the battlefield or whatever, and they all go back and it's like, no, let me bandage your hand.
Yes.
Hurt. Well, yeah.
I like wound care.
Yeah. They have to rip a piece of the shirt off to be like, give me a second.
Yes.
So that always,
I love that.
so good. In terms of tropes I don't like, oh man, I mean, I tend to write really fluffy romances, so the sort of like darker, more like, focusing on sort of the more potentially toxic relationships or something that I like to write about, but I would have a hard time writing about it. Or I like to read about it, but writing about it is something that I might struggle with a little bit, just I'm just a real sort of bubbly vanilla person.
And I always love anything enemies to lovers combined with forced proximity, whether that's with beds, whether that's with horses, whatever the thing is. Like I want the enemies to be together. I want them to be forced to confront the fact they find each other very hot. Conversely, I have a very hard time with friends to lovers because where are the swords? Where are the They're not dueling. No, but really, it's because I love having the baseline of conflict of two characters with opposing goals, having to find a way to merge those goals or give up their goals or navigate that. I find that so interesting that when they already like each other, I think I would just have a really hard time writing that, and I really respect the people who can write friends to lovers romance that really suck you in, because that seems so much harder to me. It seems a higher level of difficulty.
Are you even lovers if you don't have swords at each other's throats?
I love a reluctant allies trope, and I love fake engagement, guys. I think it just comes from being like a repressed South Asian. It's, like I had a fake engagement, not fake, but a sort of repressed engagement where like we really, our parents were watching, and I was just like, really, why do you have to watch all the time? But in terms of a trope I couldn't write, I do not love the age gap stuff. I can't write like a daddy. It's just not my thing, you know? And it's like I don't love to read it, and I don't love to write it. There's like a big age gap. I feel like the only thing where I was like, okay, I'm just gonna not think about it was Twilight. I was like, you're like 126 or whatever, but I forced myself not to think about it. I was like, no, he's 17 or whatever. He goes to high school, it's fine.
I came into the Twilight kind of too late. It was when I moved to the US and I was like an adult and I was like hundreds of years old. Like what is happening? I'm totally in with the enemies to lovers. I love it. I'm also like, if there are no swords and if she's not trying to like stab him and kill him, like where's the romance? That's my favorite thing to write. I think I have difficult tropes that I personally can't write. Like I don't think I'm good with friends to lovers either. I don't think I'm good with second chance romances, I think, but I've read them and I've just like loved them. I recently read a second chance romance, and I finished it in like 3 hours and totally sucked me in. So what I can write is different from what I love reading.
My favorite trope is very niche. You know, when someone's out on the ice and then they fall and the other person pulls them up and then they have to snuggle naked.
That's very specific. But I love it.
It's coming. Yes, that's very niche. As far as I feel, I never say that I totally hate a trope because there's always going to be some author that does it so well that I love it. But I don't usually gravitate towards a lot of like the really darker bully romance stuff. I know it's super popular, and I'm sure that there's authors that there are authors that can write really well, but it's not something that I would ever personally write. I like the hero too. You can be mean anyway.
I'm trying to come up with a name for your niche trope, maybe like hypothermia. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to answer these questions. Thank you all for coming out.